the most aggressive combat general in the American Army, commanded an army that didn't exist. No real tanks, no real soldiers, no real guns, and pinned 19 German divisions to the wrong coastline for 7 weeks. George S. Patton, 3 stars, the man who'd raced Montgomery to Messina, who'd slapped 2 shell-shocked privates in field hospitals and nearly lost everything for it. By January 1944, he was the most dangerous general the Allies had, and the most useless. Sidelined, disgraced, one more headline away from being shipped home. So the Allies gave him a job nobody else could do. They handed him a fake army, 11 phantom divisions made of wood, canvas, and empty oil drums, parked it across from the narrowest stretch of the English Channel, and let the Germans draw their own conclusions. Patton's name on the roster, Patton's face at the inspections, Patton's voice in hotel lobbies, loud enough for anyone listening. The Germans kept 100,000 troops waiting for an invasion he was never going to lead. The deception was supposed to last 2 weeks. It held for 7, and the man who'd built his whole life around fighting won his biggest battle without firing a single round. If a story where the weapon isn't a tank or a rifle, but a reputation, is worth your time, hit subscribe and tap the bell. More untold chapters coming soon. On August 3rd, 1943, Patton walked into the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, Sicily. He'd been visiting the wounded, something he did often, partly out of genuine concern, partly because he believed a general's presence in the ward was worth more than a week's ration of morphine. The wards were full. Men with shattered legs, shrapnel wounds, burns that had melted uniform fabric into skin. Patton moved from cot to cot, pinning Purple Hearts on pillows, gripping hands, telling men they'd done their duty. And then he stopped at the cot of Private Charles H. Cool from Mishawaka, Indiana. Cool didn't have a visible wound. No bandages, no cast, no dressing. Patton asked him what was wrong. Cool said he was nervous, said he couldn't take it. Patton lost it. He slapped Cool across the face with his gloves, called him a coward, and ordered him back to the front. The medical staff froze. Nobody moved. Patton stormed out of the tent. 7 days later, he did it again. August 10th, the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. This time, the soldier was Private Paul Bennett, a 4-year veteran and artilleryman from South Carolina who'd been in combat continuously since the North Africa landings, months of it without rotation. Bennett was shaking, crying. A doctor had diagnosed him with severe combat exhaustion, what the Army called battle fatigue, what a later generation would recognize as a wound no one could see. Bennett had actually asked to stay with his unit. His commanding officer had ordered him to the rear against Bennett's own wishes. None of that mattered to Patton. He slapped Bennett hard enough to knock his helmet liner off, grabbed him by his collar, and shoved him toward the tent entrance. The hospital commander, Colonel Donald Grubb, had to physically step between them before Patton left the ward. Now, 2 things happened at once. The first was that word spread through the 7th Army like a brush fire. Medics talked, nurses talked, officers who'd been in the tent wrote reports. Within days, 3 separate accounts landed on Eisenhower's desk at Allied Force headquarters in Algiers. The second, and this is what made the whole situation impossible, was that Patton had just conquered Sicily. He'd beaten Montgomery to Messina in one of the most dramatic races of the war, pushing his divisions through brutal mountain terrain along the island's northern coast, around blown bridges and demolished roadblocks, covering over 100 miles in barely more than a week. The British had been given the main axis of advance up the eastern shore. Patton had been assigned the supporting role to the west, and Patton had gotten to Messina first. His 7th Army had come of age as a fighting force under fire, and American troops had proven, for the first time in the European theater, that they could outfight and outmaneuver the best the British had. So Eisenhower had a problem with no clean answer. He couldn't afford to lose Patton, not with France on the horizon. He also couldn't pretend nothing had happened. Eisenhower sat down and wrote Patton a letter, and the opening line didn't soften anything. The report he'd received was, in Eisenhower's words, shocking in its allegations against Patton's personal conduct. Eisenhower went on. There was no excuse for losing his temper in front of subordinates, and no excuse for being rough with the sick and injured. The order was clear. Apologize, not privately, not in a memo, in person, to every division in the 7th Army, and to both soldiers, face to face. Patton did it. He wrote an apology note to Eisenhower. Then he started making the rounds, division by division, standing in front of formations of men he'd just led through one of the hardest campaigns of the war. On August 30th, he stood before the 3rd Infantry Division, the same troops who'd stormed the beaches at Licata and fought their way up through the Sicilian interior, and began his short speech. And here's the thing, the troops figured out what was happening before Patton got through his first sentence. They didn't let him finish. Soldiers stamped their boots, clapped, yelled that he had nothing to apologize for. Officers in the front rows looked at the ground. Patton could barely get the words out. That night, Patton wrote in his diary that the whole affair amounted to an army commander being forced to grovel to a shirker just to keep the press happy. He still didn't think he'd done anything wrong. And if you think the worst was over for Patton, it wasn't. For 3 months, Eisenhower and Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall managed to keep the full story out of the American press. War correspondents in the theater knew about at least one of the incidents almost immediately, and Eisenhower personally appealed to them to sit on it. They did, for a while. Roughly 60 reporters who knew the story agreed to hold it. The reasoning was simple. Patton was too valuable to lose over a slap. Marshall agreed. Eisenhower agreed. The lid stayed on through September, October, most of November. Then Drew Pearson tore it off. On the evening of November 21st, 1943, Pearson, a syndicated columnist and radio broadcaster with a reputation for going exactly where the Army didn't want him to go, opened his 15-minute program on the Blue Network with the story. Lieutenant General George S. Patton had struck a hospitalized soldier in Sicily. General Eisenhower had severely reprimanded him for it. Pearson added his own editorial prediction. He didn't expect Patton to be used in important combat again. The reaction was instant and coast to coast. Newspapers ran it front page. Editorial boards demanded Patton's stars. Veterans groups called him a disgrace to the uniform. In Washington, Oklahoma Representative Jed Johnson called Patton's conduct despicable. Iowa Republican Charles Hoven, himself a combat veteran, said men like Patton had no place in the Army. Constituents flooded congressional offices with letters and telegrams. There was talk of court-martial, talk of shipping him home on the next transport, talk of stripping his rank and ending his career entirely. The same general who'd been on the cover of Time magazine 3 months earlier was now a political liability that nobody in Washington wanted to touch. Eisenhower clamped a gag order on Patton. No more speeches, no more public appearances, no more contact with reporters. Stay out of sight, stay quiet. The most recognizable American general in the war was told, in effect, to disappear. And Patton, for once, obeyed. He sat in a villa in Palermo through the fall and winter of 1943, while the war ground forward without him. The Allied campaign in Italy stalled at the Gustav Line, at Cassino, at Anzio, places where Patton's brand of aggressive, fast-moving, armored warfare might have changed the arithmetic. Nobody asked him. He read the situation reports, wrote in his diary, rode his horses around the Sicilian countryside, and waited for a call that didn't come. Weeks turned into months. The months kept adding up. Every week brought fresh reminders of what Patton was missing. New offensives, new commands being handed out, new stars being pinned on other men's shoulders. Meanwhile, the Allies were planning the biggest amphibious invasion in human history, Operation Overlord, the cross-channel assault on France, and Patton wasn't in the room. His former subordinate, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, was. Bradley, the quiet, methodical Missourian whom Patton had commanded at Tkun Corps in North Africa, who'd served under him again in Sicily, had been steadily climbing the chain while Patton sat on the bench. Now Bradley was given overall command of American ground forces for the invasion. He'd plan the breakout. He'd lead the armies across the beaches of Normandy. He'd get the assignment Patton had spent his entire career preparing for. Picture that for a second. You're George Patton. You've just won the most dramatic American campaign of the war, and you're sitting in a borrowed villa, reading about other men's assignments in the Stars and Stripes because you couldn't keep your hands to yourself in a hospital tent. The fire that made Patton unstoppable on a battlefield, the absolute refusal to tolerate weakness, the fury that pushed men past what they thought they could endure, was the same fire that made him slap a shaking private in a hospital bed. It wasn't two different impulses pulling in opposite directions. It was one impulse. and it had just cost him the biggest command of the war. By January 1944, George S. Patton was the best combat general the American Army had, and he had nowhere to go. On January 26, 1944, Patton landed in England, not as a conquering general, returning to plan the liberation of Europe. As a problem Eisenhower hadn't figured out what to do with yet, Patton was given quarters in Peover Hall, a country estate in Cheshire, about as far from the real planning centres as a 3-star general could get without being sent home. And within days, he was told the terms. He wouldn't be leading American forces on D-Day. That job belonged to Bradley, the man he'd commanded in Tunisia, the man he'd outranked in Sicily. Patton wouldn't be planning the breakout either. He wouldn't be drawing the arrows on the maps or picking the beaches. What Eisenhower needed from him was something else entirely, something no other general in the Allied chain of command could provide. Eisenhower needed Patton's name. Here's what was happening behind closed doors. Since late 1943, a secret group of Allied military officers called the London Controlling Section had been building one of the most elaborate deception operations in the history of warfare. The plan was called Operation Fortitude, and its southern component, Fortitude South, had one job: convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion of France would hit the Pas de Calais, the narrowest crossing point of the English Channel, and not Normandy. If the deception worked, it would pin a massive chunk of the German army to the wrong stretch of coastline, while the real invasion force landed 150 miles to the southwest. If it failed, the troops hitting the Normandy beaches would face not just the divisions already there, but the full weight of the German 15th Army swinging down from the north. The margin between success and catastrophe was, in large part, a question of whether the Germans could be fooled long enough. The centerpiece of Fortitude South was a phantom army. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, existed on paper, in radio traffic, and in the fields of Kent and Essex. It had 11 divisions on its organizational chart. It had a headquarters. It had a distinctive unit insignia. What it didn't have was soldiers, or tanks, or guns, or anything that could actually cross the English Channel and fight. The tanks were made of wood frames, canvas sheeting, and empty 40-gallon oil drums. From the air, and German reconnaissance aircraft did fly over southeastern England periodically. They looked convincing enough. Rows of them, parked in fields, covered with camouflage netting, arranged in the dispersal patterns a real armoured division would use. Dummy vehicles, dummy artillery pieces, dummy landing craft assembled from scaffolding tube and planking moored in the harbours and estuaries around Dover and the Kent coast. Real tyre tracks were pressed into the mud around the fake equipment to simulate movement. Real roads were graded to connect fake supply dumps. Camp structures went up. Latrines were dug. The attention to detail was obsessive and deliberate because it had to be. One sloppy prop, one installation that didn't match the pattern of a real army camp, and the entire illusion could unravel under a single aerial photograph. And underneath Dover Castle, in tunnels that had been carved into the chalk cliffs centuries earlier, British and Canadian communications troops worked around the clock, 8-hour shifts, 7 days a week, with no breaks and no leave, transmitting a torrent of fake-coded radio messages across the airwaves. Supply requisitions for units that didn't exist, movement orders for divisions that were made of plywood, training schedules, equipment transfers, personnel rotations, all of it encrypted, all of it designed to sound exactly like the administrative chatter of a massive army group gearing up for an invasion. The signalers themselves had no idea what they were sending. All the operators knew was that the work was important enough to keep them underground in artificial light for weeks at a stretch. So FUSAG had the hardware, it had the radio traffic, it had the infrastructure. What it still needed was a face, a commanding general credible enough to make the German intelligence apparatus look at all of this and conclude without reservation that the Allies were assembling their main invasion force in southeastern England. That's where Patton came in. The German High Command had more respect for Patton than for almost any other Allied field commander. The dictator himself had reportedly called Patton their best general. German military intelligence, the Foreign Army's West Section specifically, considered Patton the most likely candidate to lead any major assault into France, and the logic, from the German side, was almost unassailable. The Allies wouldn't bench their most aggressive, most experienced combat general for the biggest operation of the war. Wherever Patton was stationed, that's where the main blow would fall. The Allies were counting on exactly that logic. Patton was publicly announced as commander of WWII in early 1944, and from that point on, everything Patton did in England was a performance. He visited fake installations and was photographed doing it. He attended public events, gave speeches at women's clubs and service organizations across southeastern England, showed up at receptions, shook hands, and made himself visible. Always in the southeast, always within the geography that supported the Calais story. His movements were calculated to leave a trail that German intelligence could pick up, analyze, and misread. Now, Patton wasn't the only tool in the box. The deception ran on two legs, and the second one was arguably more important than Patton's public theatre. That leg was the double-cross system, a network of German spies who'd been captured by British intelligence, turned and run as double agents, feeding their handlers in Berlin a carefully constructed stream of false information. Two of these turned agents were critical to making WWII believable. The first was a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo. Pujol was a Barcelona-born civilian with no military training and no intelligence background who'd walked into the British embassy and volunteered his services because he despised the regime in Berlin. MI5 set him up in a safe house at 35 Crespigny Road in Hendon, North London. And from that modest two-story house, Pujol built a fictional intelligence empire, 27 sub-agents, all of them invented, none of them real, feeding the German military intelligence service, the Abwehr, a stream of reports so detailed, so frequent, and so internally consistent that the Germans considered him one of their most valuable assets in Britain. From January 1944 onward, Pujol sent over 500 radio messages, sometimes more than 20 in a single day, reinforcing the existence of WWII, its order of battle, its state of readiness, and its intention to strike at the Pas de Calais. The second agent was a Pole named Roman Czerniawski, codenamed Brutus. Czerniawski had run an actual resistance intelligence network in occupied France before being captured by the Germans and recruited as their spy, or so the Germans believed. In reality, MI5 had turned Czerniawski back before he ever set foot in Britain. Brutus confirmed from a second independent channel everything that Garbo was reporting. WWII was real, Patton was in command, and the target was Calais. So the deception had three layers working in concert. The physical layer, dummy equipment, and fake infrastructure scattered across southeastern England. The signals layer, around-the-clock encrypted radio traffic simulating an entire army group's administrative and operational communications. And the human layer, double agents feeding the German intelligence service exactly what the Allies wanted them to believe. Patton's name sat on top of all three, the visible tip of a weapon made of wood, canvas, radio waves, and carefully managed lies. And Patton hated every second of it. He was a fighting general, a man who'd trained his whole life to lead armored columns across enemy territory, who'd written tactical manuals on tank warfare, who'd spent 2 decades waiting for the next war. And his contribution to the most important military operation in modern history was to stand in front of fake tanks, smile for photographs, and pretend to command a force that couldn't fire a single round. The assignment was the ultimate insult, dressed up as a compliment. The thing that made Patton valuable to Fortitude wasn't his tactical brilliance, his battlefield instincts, or his decades of combat experience. It was his reputation, his notoriety, the very quality that had gotten him into trouble. His larger-than-life, uncontrollable public persona was now the only thing the Allies needed from him. There's a kind of humiliation in that equation that only a warrior would fully feel. Being told that your greatest contribution to the war effort isn't what you can do, it's what the enemy is afraid you might do. Your entire value to the operation comes not from your skill, not from your experience, not from anything you've spent your life building. It comes from your shadow, and you have to stand in it, quietly, while other men lead the fight. Patton played the role. He didn't have a choice. The price of staying in the war at all was to become a prop in someone else's operation, hold still when the camera clicked, and wait, day after day, week after week, for the moment when Eisenhower might hand him a real army again. On April the 25th, 1944, Patton nearly destroyed everything: the deception, his career, and possibly the invasion itself, with a single off-the-cuff remark at a women's club in Knutsford, England. The event was small. A local organisation called the Welcome Club had invited Patton to say a few words at its opening ceremony. The club was set up to provide a social space for American GIs stationed in the area, and Patton's appearance was supposed to be a low-key goodwill gesture. Patton had been told the event was private. No press, no record, just a room full of local women, a few dozen American and British servicemen, and a 3-star general expected to say something friendly, shake a few hands, and leave. So Patton relaxed. And when Patton relaxed, Patton talked. He stood up and told the audience, in the easy, confident drawl that made him such a natural speaker, that it was the evident destiny of the British and the Americans to rule the world. Then he paused and added, and of course, the Russians. The problem was that a local newspaper reporter had slipped into the room, and the reporter didn't include the part about the Russians. What hit the wire services the next morning was a senior American general publicly declaring that Britain and America, and only Britain and America, were destined to rule the post-war world. The Soviets, at that moment losing tens of thousands of men per week on the Eastern Front, were simply erased from the quote. The story detonated across both sides of the Atlantic within 48 hours. In Washington, congressmen who'd already been looking for a reason to end Patton's career had a fresh one. In Moscow, the omission of Russia from a statement about post-war destiny was exactly the kind of insult that could strain the alliance at the worst possible moment. And at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in London, Eisenhower read the wire service report, and the temperature in the room dropped. On April 29th, Eisenhower sat down and wrote a cable to Marshall in Washington. The language was blunt. Patton, Eisenhower wrote, was unable to use reasonably good sense in all those matters where senior commanders must appreciate the effect of their own actions upon public opinion and upon the execution of national policy. Eisenhower was done making excuses. The question he put to Marshall was whether Patton was worth the trouble anymore, whether the risk of keeping him outweighed the cost of sending him home. 2 days later, on the morning of May 1st, Patton drove to Eisenhower's headquarters for what he believed might be the last conversation of his military career. He wrote about it in his diary that night. The original entry is preserved at the Library of Congress, and the opening line tells you everything about how Patton processed pressure. In spite of possible execution this morning, I slept well and trust my destiny. God has never let me, or the country, down yet. Patton walked into Eisenhower's office. Eisenhower asked him to sit down, which Patton took as a marginally good sign. Then Eisenhower looked at him and said, "George, you have gotten yourself into a very serious fix." And Patton, to his credit, didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't try to talk his way out. What Patton said was this: "Before you go any farther, I want to say that your job is more important than mine. So if in trying to save me, you are hurting yourself, throw me out." Eisenhower, according to Patton's diary, told him the issue wasn't about hurting Eisenhower. It was about Patton depriving him of a fighting army commander. The decision went to Marshall, and Marshall, for the second time in 6 months, saved Patton's career. Marshall's reasoning was practical, not sentimental. Patton was the only available American general who had direct combat experience against German forces in North Africa, who'd commanded a successful large-scale amphibious landing in Sicily, and who had the proven ability to run an army at speed across hostile territory. There was no replacement on the bench who matched that profile. Firing Patton would feel satisfying. Replacing him was a different problem. Patton stayed, barely. Eisenhower made it clear that one more incident, one more headline, one more unguarded remark, and there would be no third reprieve. Marshall wouldn't save him again. The leash was now so short that Patton could barely move without clearance. What happened next was pure theatre, and this time, Patton was in on the script. Sometime in May 1944, the Allies arranged a dinner that had nothing to do with hospitality and everything to do with deception. The guest of honor was General Lieutenant Hans Kramer, the last commander of the Afrika Korps, who'd been captured in Tunisia in 1943 and had been held as a prisoner of war in Britain ever since. Kramer was being repatriated to Germany through a prisoner exchange via Sweden, a routine process, and someone at Allied intelligence saw an opportunity. Patton was told to host Kramer at dinner, sit across from him, talk shop, drop hints, mention the Pas de Calais, mention Fusag, Be George Patton, loud, confident, impossible to miss, and let Kramer form his own conclusions about what the Americans were planning and where they were planning to do it. And here's where the deception turned elegant. Kramer's journey from his POW camp to the port of embarkation was routed through the southwestern counties of England, the real staging area for the Normandy invasion. Kramer would have seen convoys, supply dumps, camps packed with troops, the unmistakable buildup of a massive military operation, all real, all pointed at Normandy. The problem was that every road sign along Kramer's route had been swapped. The place names he saw through the car windows, the towns, the junctions, the directional markers, all pointed to southeastern England, Kent, Essex, Dover, Fusag territory. Kramer rode through the real invasion force and was made to believe he was looking at Fusag. On May 23rd, Kramer crossed into Sweden and from there made his way back to Germany. Kramer was debriefed by German military intelligence within days of arriving, and what he told them confirmed everything Garbo and Brutus had been feeding through the intelligence channels. Patton was in command of a massive force in southeastern England, and the target was the Pas-de-Calais. Kramer had seen it with his own eyes. Around the same time, Patton added one more detail to the performance. At a hotel, accounts place it in London, Patton spotted Brigadier General James Gavin across the lobby. Gavin was with the 82nd Airborne, and everybody in the senior officer corps knew the Airborne would be jumping into France on D-Day. Patton didn't lower his voice, didn't pull Gavin aside. He called out across the lobby, loud enough for every officer, every clerk, and every civilian in earshot. "See you in the Pas-de-Calais, Gavin." It wasn't an accident. It wasn't Patton being reckless. It was Patton doing exactly what the Allies needed him to do, performing for any ears that might be listening, planting one more seed in the deception. The man who couldn't stop talking when he should have stayed quiet was now being paid to talk loudly and say the wrong thing on purpose. Patton's reputation was so large by this point that even his throwaway remarks carried strategic weight. German intelligence had built an entire analytical framework on a single assumption: the Allies would never waste their best general on a secondary front. That assumption was perfectly rational. In almost any other scenario, it would have been correct. The problem for the Germans was that this time, the Allies weren't wasting Patton. They were weaponizing the exact thing the Germans believed about him. And Patton, for all his fury at being sidelined, was the only man alive who could make the weapon work. By late May 1944, the trap was set. Garbo's messages, Brutus's confirmations, the dummy equipment in Kent, the radio traffic from Dover, Kramer's eyewitness testimony, Patton's public visibility, all of it pointed at one conclusion: the main Allied invasion would hit the Pas-de-Calais. Patton would lead it, and the German 15th Army, 19 infantry divisions, 2 armored divisions, dug in along the narrowest stretch of the channel, sat and waited for the blow. The invasion was days away. 156,000 men were about to cross the English Channel, storm 5 beaches, and attempt the largest amphibious assault ever mounted. And Patton, the general the Germans were most afraid of, wasn't going with them. At 3 o'clock in the morning on June 6, 1944, Garbo sat down at his radio transmitter in the safe house in Hendon and began tapping out a call signal to his handler at the Abwehr station in Madrid. The message he had was urgent enough that the Allies had authorized him to transmit what would amount to genuine advance warning of the Normandy landings, a calculated risk designed to protect his credibility for the far bigger lie that would follow. Nobody answered. The German radio operator in Madrid had gone to bed. Garbo kept transmitting. For hours, the call signal went out again and again into the dark, bouncing off the ionosphere and landing on a receiver that nobody was sitting in front of. Across the English Channel, at that exact moment, the largest seaborne invasion in human history was already in motion. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 156,000 troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, and a dozen other nations were crossing 100 miles of open water toward 5 beaches on the coast of Normandy. Paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne were already on the ground behind German lines, scattered across the flooded fields of the Cotentin Peninsula. Naval guns had begun their bombardment. The first landing craft were circling in the assembly areas off Utah and Omaha, waiting for the signal to head for shore. And Garbo, the most important double agent in the Allied intelligence arsenal, the man whose next transmission could determine whether the deception held or collapsed, couldn't get Madrid to pick up the phone. The connection finally came through around 8 in the morning, 5 hours late. Garbo was livid. He tore into his German handler with a fury that was only partly theatrical. The anger served a purpose because it reinforced Garbo's cover as a loyal German agent who'd been let down by his own side's incompetence. The message he'd been trying to send, Garbo told Madrid, was a warning that the Normandy landings were imminent. He'd had the intelligence hours before the first troops hit the beach. He'd tried to transmit in time, and the Abwehr had slept through it. The Germans apologized, and then Garbo delivered the real payload. Over the next several hours, Garbo transmitted what amounted to a 129-minute strategic briefing, the longest single message he'd ever sent. The core argument was simple, and it was devastating. Normandy was a diversion. The landings were a feint, designed to draw German reserves south and west, to pull panzers away from the real target. The main blow, the decisive one, the one that would determine the outcome of the war in the west, was still coming, and it was aimed at the Pas de Calais. Fusag hadn't moved. Patton hadn't moved. The 11 divisions in southeastern England were still in position, still at full strength, still waiting for the order to embark. Garbo backed up the claim with an avalanche of fabricated detail. Unit identifications, readiness assessments, supply status reports, order of battle data drawn from his network of 27 imaginary sub-agents scattered across Britain. All of it designed to look like the product of a massive, well-placed intelligence operation confirming the same conclusion from multiple independent sources. The message was encrypted, transmitted to Madrid, relayed to Berlin, flagged as high priority, and placed on the desk of Colonel Friedrich Adolf Krummacher, the intelligence liaison to the dictator's military headquarters. What happened next is one of the most consequential intelligence decisions of the 20th century. The German High Command bought it, not partially, not with reservations, not as one possibility among several. They bought the entire package. On the morning of June 7th, less than 24 hours after 156,000 Allied troops had stormed the beaches of Normandy, the dictator's headquarters issued an order halting the movement of reserves toward the beachhead. The 15th Army was to remain in position along the Pas de Calais. The threat from Fusag was assessed as real, imminent, and potentially larger in scale than the Normandy operation. Reinforcements that could have reached the beachhead within days were frozen in place, staring at an empty stretch of ocean, waiting for an army that would never come. And if you understand the military arithmetic of those first days, you understand why this mattered so much. The Normandy beachhead in its first week was fragile. The Allies were fighting to expand a narrow strip of coastline against determined German resistance, with supplies bottlenecked through damaged harbours and open beaches. A concentrated armoured counterattack, the kind the Germans had used to devastating effect at Kasserine Pass and Anzio, launched in the first 72 hours before the beachhead had depth and before Allied air superiority could fully establish itself, could have pushed the whole operation back into the sea. The forces needed for that counterattack existed. They were sitting in the 15th Army sector, less than 200 miles to the northeast, and they never came. The numbers tell the rest. 19 German infantry divisions and 2 armoured divisions, the entire 15th Army, stayed pinned to the Calais coast. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte, one of the most experienced armoured formations in the German military, was held north of the Seine River and wasn't released toward Normandy until late June, weeks after the beachhead had been secured and reinforced beyond any realistic prospect of a German counter-offensive. Panzer Group West's ability to concentrate armour for a decisive blow was crippled not by Allied bombing alone, not by fuel shortages alone, but by the simple fact that the German command structure still believed the real invasion hadn't started yet. The Allies had hoped the deception would hold for 2 weeks, maybe 3, if everything went perfectly. It held for 7 weeks, during which the German 15th Army sat in its fortifications along the Pas de Calais, scanning the horizon for Patton's Phantom Fleet, while 150 miles to the southwest, the real Allied force poured men, tanks, ammunition, and fuel across the Normandy beaches at a rate that grew every single day. By the time the Germans finally accepted that Normandy was the main invasion and began shifting the 15th Army south, the window for a successful counterattack had closed. The beachhead was a fortress. And where was Patton during all of this? In England, watching, waiting, writing letters to his wife Beatrice that read like dispatches from a man locked behind glass while the world outside was on fire. On June 6th, the day the invasion he'd spent his whole career training for finally launched, Patton sat down and wrote, "It is hell to be on the sidelines and see all the glory eluding me." Think about what that sentence contains. Not anger at Eisenhower for benching him, not bitterness toward Bradley for taking his place, not resentment at the deception plan that had turned him into a prop. Just a man staring at the single biggest moment of his professional life as it passed him by, and the only word he could reach for was hell. Patton had commanded the Western Task Force at Casablanca, the first major American amphibious assault of the war in the European theater. He'd led the 7th Army across the beaches of Sicily. He'd spent 25 years studying armored warfare, amphibious operations, and combined arms tactics at every level from platoon to army. Everything in his career had been building toward a moment exactly like June 6, 1944. And on that day, the most prepared combat general in the American army was sitting in a room in England, writing a letter to his wife. The deception kept running even after D-Day. Garbo continued transmitting. Brutus continued confirming. The dummy equipment stayed in the fields. The radio traffic kept humming from the Dover tunnels. And the Germans continued believing. 6 weeks after the Normandy landings, the Abwehr's Madrid station forwarded a recommendation to Berlin that Garbo be awarded the Iron Cross for his outstanding service to German intelligence. The request was approved. The dictator himself signed off on it. Juan Pujol Garcia, a Barcelona civilian who'd walked into a British embassy because he hated fascism, who'd invented 27 fake spies, who'd fed the German military over 500 false reports from a rented house in North London, received the Iron Cross, second class, from the government he'd been systematically deceiving for 3 years. Pujol already held the Member of the Order of the British Empire, awarded by King George VI, one man, 2 medals, from opposite sides of the same war, and the weapon that had made all of it credible, the name that sat on top of Fusag's organizational chart, the name that German intelligence trusted more than their own aerial photographs, the name that kept 19 divisions frozen on the wrong coastline for 7 weeks, belonged to a general who hadn't fired a round, hadn't crossed the channel, and hadn't commanded a single real soldier since Sicily. The most effective weapon in the D-Day deception wasn't the dummy tanks rotting in the fields of Kent. It wasn't the encrypted radio chatter humming out of the tunnels under Dover Castle. It wasn't even Garbo's 129-minute masterpiece of strategic misdirection. It was the reputation of a general who'd been too reckless to keep his hands to himself in a hospital tent and too famous for the enemy to ignore. On August 1st, 1944, George S. Patton took command of the United States Third Army. Real tanks, real soldiers, real artillery, real orders with real objectives pointed at real German positions. After 11 months on the bench, 11 months of fake installations, fake speeches, fake radio traffic, and a fake army made of wood and canvas, Patton was back. Eisenhower had kept him in reserve through the Normandy breakout, through the hedgerow fighting, through the grinding weeks of July when the beachhead seemed to shrink into a stalemate. And now, with Operation Cobra smashing a hole through the German lines at St. Lo, Eisenhower finally played the card he'd been holding since January. Patton hit the ground like a man who'd been caged for a year, because he had been. The Third Army poured through the gap in the German front and didn't stop. In 2 weeks, Patton's divisions covered more ground than any Allied force had managed in 2 months. Avranches, Rennes, Le Mans. The Third Army swept south, then east, then north, encircling German formations, cutting supply lines, and moving so fast that the retreating German units couldn't establish defensive positions before Patton's lead elements were already behind them. It was exactly the kind of warfare Patton had spent his entire career studying. Fast, aggressive, relentless, the kind of mobile armored operation that turned a breakthrough into a rout. By the end of August, the Third Army had liberated most of Brittany, crossed the Seine, and was racing toward the German border. The general, who'd spent the spring inspecting dummy tanks in Kent, was now commanding the most effective fighting force on the Western Front. The prop had become the spearhead, The Ghost Commander had become the most dangerous man in France, and here's the thing that makes the whole arc land differently when you step back from it. For 11 months, the Allies used Patton's worst quality, his uncontrollable, larger-than-life, headline-generating personality, as a strategic weapon. They took the thing that had nearly ended his career and turned it into the thing that helped win the most important battle of the war. Patton didn't plan the deception. He didn't run it. He didn't even like it. All he had to do was be himself, be loud, be visible, be impossible to ignore, and the enemy did the rest. The same impulse that made him slap a private in a hospital tent, the same inability to stay quiet and stay small, was precisely what made the Germans believe that wherever Patton was, the main attack had to follow. They couldn't conceive of an army that would sideline a man like that, and that failure of imagination cost them France. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing about a person isn't what they can do. It's what the other side is convinced they're about to do. Patton sat on a bench for 11 months, and his name, just the name, just the reputation, just the shadow of what he might do next, pinned more enemy divisions in place than most generals manage with a full army at their backs. The German 15th Army waited at the Pas de Calais for 7 weeks after D-Day. 19 infantry divisions, 2 armored divisions, dug in along a coastline, watching an empty horizon, waiting for a fleet that was never going to sail, a general who was never going to arrive, and an army that had never existed. By the time the order finally came to move south, the beaches at Normandy were a supply hub. The hedgerows had been broken, and Patton, the real Patton, with real tanks, was already 100 miles into France. The battle they'd been preparing for was already over. The invasion they'd been bracing for had already happened, 150 miles away, 7 weeks earlier. They just hadn't been told.